This is chatting around the fireside, and this is really a personal journey from my point of view that I'm wanting to play back to you now. That's been over the course of the last 15 months. I can lay the blame or the privilege at the foot of Michelle Wood and Brogan McPherson from PTRC. I got an email from them exactly 15 months ago today saying, would you be interested in chairing a conversation about how the pandemic might be affecting the transport sector? To which, of course, I said, yes, that sounds fascinating. What I didn't realise was that that was going to become an obsession almost over the 15 months that followed. And we went from a single event into it becoming a series. And I think it was Brogan who used the term fireside chat. And I had to have a look around to see where did this term come from, and realised that it originates from when President Roosevelt had people huddled around the wireless sets in their homes and was trying to give them soothing words at a time of economic crisis and other disruption in the United States many decades ago. So I guess Brogan picked well. It seemed a fitting title for us as transport professionals huddling together around our digital devices to commune during during the pandemic. Though back in March last year and April, we didn't perhaps appreciate just how long the road ahead was going to be. What you can see on screen is what I've called the class of 2020 to 2021. And you can see, I hope, immediately the richness of talent that certainly I've had the privilege of engaging with on this journey, the many conversations we've had, most but not all that I've been involved with, and the fantastic sense of diversity, and a big reminder for me that, we must do much more, all of us, to reach out to the diversity of talent and perspective that we have at our disposal within our sector. So what I wanted to do today, and it will only be a whistle-stop tour, is to reflect back on what amounts to 15 hours worth of conversations, and I can say many, many thousands of words of write-up, to just give you as high a level view as I can. But it really has felt to me like this has been a reflective examination of our whole sector, and really illuminated just the enormity of issues that we're dealing with across a whole variety of areas. So take your mind back to last April when the first event took place. And at that point, we'd all were just adjusting to being in lockdown and working from home. If you're in the UK, of course, it was an enforced working from home unless you had to go to work. And so what did we find from the first conversation? Well, a real sense that the whole world had just been required almost on the head of a pin to change its behaviours in some ways. And the fact that we could see how we were able to adapt was giving a great sense of optimism that perhaps that meant we could change for the longer term and in a way that pointed to better outcomes for the future. We were seeing a reallocation of road space in particular, a resharing of street space away from cars towards active travel. And at that point, at least, there was real optimism that this tactical urbanism was bringing about change that might be a sign of things to come. And yes, there were a sense of threat and uncertainty facing us all, but also opportunity within the flux, opportunities in the immediate term, coping with the pandemic, opportunities in how we might transition out of it, and then the longer term challenges that we might turn on into advantages for us as a sector. Perhaps we would find ourselves having to ask some difficult questions now about infrastructure investment and whether prior cases that have been approved for new road capacity in particular were any more able to be substantiated and justified in the face of the paradigm shift we felt we were feeling. And it was Tim Gent actually who raised the prospect that perhaps we were becoming or required to become superheroes now in our profession, a time when transport planners really did have an obligation and opportunity to help change the world. Well, the next fireside chat, and it doesn't seem perhaps so remarkable now, but this would have seemed incredible 2 years ago, that we were faced with a position where government advice was saying, please avoid public transport if you can. If possible, walk, cycle, or go by car if you need to travel. Remarkably, public health was being seen as something in conflict with use of public transport, irrespective, it has to be said, of any evidence available to support that assumption that was being made. I remember seeing, and I think we've had reference earlier today to what I call ghost buses, where passenger demand was on its knees due to social distancing and the government messaging, which was reinforcing problems for the industry. We were also seeing early signs of the social inequality associated with the pandemic, or an exacerbation of underlying inequality, and perhaps epitomised by this notion of key workers driving other key workers to work. So while I was enjoying the privilege of having gone from hypermobile to sitting in my slippers at home working, some of our key workers in the form of bus drivers were exposed to the pandemic, driving other key workers to work. It gave a real insight to the public transport sector that they were going to need to up their game, and will need to up their game looking forwards. Perhaps criticism already, the industry recognised that it was tending to focus on providing services for yesterday's demand rather than being more anticipatory about meeting the demands of the future. And my goodness, that challenge has grown much more in the pandemic. And we were starting to see nasty signs of racial discrimination, and recognising that this was something that had to be tackled head on, discrimination affecting not only staff on our public transport services, but passengers as well. Moving quickly on, we moved in the next Fireside chat, which was chaired by Steve Gooding, to the question, we used the Monty Python phrase, what have our roads ever done for us? And then on to the question of what do we want them to do for us in future? This Fireside chat came on the back of the 70-year celebration of the Rhys Jeffreys Road Fund, which Steve and I are trustees of, but also RIS2 had come out with its £27 billion plans for the biggest road building investment ever, plus a framework for developing the transport decarbonisation plan. There's a strong message in the conversation about rethinking roads use. So it was much more a focus on how we reallocate road space rather than wanting more of them. We were reminded through the lens of toilet rolls, all of us, that whilst we tend to focus heavily on passenger movements, actually at the heart of our society is also the importance and criticality of roads supporting goods movement. And looking forwards, a sense that we have to distinguish between needs and wants of the wider public. Yes, a car-led recovery might be what some people think they want, but it's not necessarily the same as what they need. And a feeling that there needed to be a new mindset within the road sector, faced with the climate emergency and public health concerns, a call for new hearts and minds to take us forwards. I wasn't involved in the session on freight and decarbonisation, so forgive me those who were. Alan Braithwaite chaired this session if I've misrepresented you at all here, but some of the messages that were coming out from that conversation, first of all, rail freight, the first silver lining, you might say, for freight of the pandemic, in that no longer was the rail network overpopulated with trying to combine passenger demand with movement of goods. Actually, they were finding that there were longer, more efficient freight trains becoming possible due to a lack of traffic. Meanwhile, looking forwards, with the gloomy prospect, sorry, I'm jumping down one step, the gloomy prospect of unemployment as we come out of the furlough phase of the pandemic, that perhaps that would create an expected increase in driver availability to counter the driver shortage problems in the haulage industry. And that might marry up with the very starkly changed demand that's been seen for goods during the pandemic, with the suggestion of growth in online retail to as much as 50% that might be maintained post-pandemic. We've seen changed high streets, or look now at the prospect of future high streets looking very different, and goods deliveries having to fit into that. And yet at the same time, road freight, the point was made that there are still very low entry barriers to moving goods by road compared to other means. Yes, the scope for innovation, but what of decarbonisation? The panel, I'm led to believe, was sceptical about hydrogen and scratching their heads over electronic roads as two candidate solutions. So beyond battery electric, where do we go? Then we switched to walking and reminded ourselves that perhaps modal hierarchy was more of a principle than a practice. And while it was very welcome to see at the time of this fireside chat the gear change publication from the Department for Transport, I for one was very disappointed it wasn't called step change. And yet walking was back in our consciousness for all of us, professionals and the public more widely, as we adapted to local living as a result of lockdown. A positive sign for the future perhaps, and yet also inequality raised its head once again. Not all walking experiences are equal in terms of the built environment design, and yet we realised how important it was to mental health. Walking seems so ingenious, so obviously an important solution. It's a wonder drug, and yet there's no money to be made in it, so there doesn't seem to be the appetite. The question of space came up, and the irony that people sat in their cars typically would have no one sat in the passenger seat next to them, and there would be ample space between them and the car next to them. Meanwhile, other human beings were being squeezed together, cheek by jowl on the pavements in the face of the pandemic. But a sense of friction too. Perhaps the exposure to new conditions was going to create this friction from which positive views could then be vocalised as well as negative ones in terms of shaping the future. We turned with Ed Downer then in the chair for this session to the Future Transport Visions Group, which some of you may have seen earlier this week had its showcase event for a round of projects from a number of very creative young professionals, early career professionals, looking to project their voices into what now should be done in the sector. And it has been a refreshing reminder that early career professionals should always be seen as valuable contributors to shaping and communicating change. Some of the issues haven't changed since I was a young professional with other people like Nicola Kane 20 years ago looking at issues like this, but there was optimism that perhaps there were new ways of doing old things, and that early career professionals today could help turn the state of flux into an opportunity for positive change. Perhaps our early career professionals, as a generalization, are better able to connect with what might be a growing silent proportion of the population that really are hungry for change. And a reminder that even through the times of the pandemic, the importance of fellowship, coming together as we are with this conference, networking can be a great support in the earlier stages of career development. But what of modelling then? Well, we turned from walking royalty, as it had been referred to earlier, to modelling royalty for the panel we had here. And I chose to provoke the panel by reminding them of the famous George Box quote, which is, "All models are wrong, but some are useful," and suggested that also meant that all models are wrong and some are useless. We agreed on something of a compromise, perhaps, which was that all models are wrong, but they can usually be usefully used. But the key thing was the philosophy behind modelling. How do we make sure that the models we're using are used to fulfill a function, which is really about asking what is going on here in this period of flux in society? Communication, we've heard already in TPM this week, is critical to what comes from the models and how they can support and influence the decision making. We were reminded that modelling is a product of both the models and the modelers, the people who build the models and produce the analysis from them. And so rethinking, revisiting what the makeup of the modelling profession is was important. Freight was noted as the Cinderella of modelling. We're seeing more and more its importance in the digital age, where we're reliant on goods coming to us rather than going to the goods. And yet the modelling world is not really giving it the attention it deserves. Optimism on the one hand that the pandemic may have catalysed a sense of reformation within the modelling community, and yet some caution that we may still see a relapse, and maybe after July the 19th, some sense of illusion that things will slip back to how they were. The 8th session took us to perhaps one of the most thorny issues of decarbonisation. Gillian Annabelle did a fantastic presentation that affected me a couple of years ago called Rearranging the Elephants on the Titanic. And we realised in that session that we were really facing titanic obstacles as a profession. And the question, of course, is will the captain and crew change course in time in the face of the climate emergency? We need a green recovery, and yet there's a real sense of nervousness that our old friends, the car and the aeroplane, are itching to get back in on the action and reassert and establish themselves as part of the new normal. We were reminded that unlike the pandemic, there is no vaccine for the climate emergency, and indeed that we face many powerful anti-vaxxers out there. But there are dynamics of hope. The old adage that things in the short term happen more slowly than you want them to, and yet in the longer term you discover they're happening more quickly than you could have imagined, gives us some hope that over the next 10 years, as the transport decarbonisation plan makes itself known, that we really could see a pleasant sense of dynamic in the system. But communication is key again. Just as we've come to recognise the daily briefings on COVID, why shouldn't we expect to be seeing daily news briefings from government and others on how we're proceeding with both the climate crisis and tackling it? Well, having thought that was one of the most important topics of the series, I then discovered very quickly that this one, at least for me, was by far and away the most important and frankly moving topic. We had a session looking at women of colour, recognising that whilst the transport system has been designed predominantly by white middle-class males, the population it's serving is distinctly not made up predominantly of white males. And so a sense that we have minority rule, and in turn, an element of ignorance that we need to address. And what became very clear is the ignorance isn't a product of not having the resources at our fingertips to better understand race and gender perspectives on transport. It's really about each and every one of us making the time and having the inclination to look for those resources. And we even produced a reading list from this session. At opportunity. We've been so reflective on so many things during the pandemic, and racial inequality and inequality in terms of gender is something we've had substantial and emotive incidents happen over the last 15 months that have caused us to reflect and realise that surely what excuse could we have for not now trying to create a more inclusive new normal? And one of our panel members put it very plainly, we need to move from being a bystander to an upstander when it comes to these issues, and really make sure we're all trying to tackle the issues of discrimination and exclusion, not just within our profession, but within society and its use of transport. And to the last of the 10 fireside chats before we got to this transport practitioners meeting, well, if you were in the plenary this morning, you will have had a good taste of what we were discussing. We went global. We realised, of course, that whilst we'd had a global audience throughout the Fireside Chat series, all of our panels had been predominantly, if not exclusively, UK-based professionals. So we reached out across continents and had a truly international panel. And that too was an important eye-opener. After all, remind ourselves, the UK represents less than 1% of the world's population, and particularly when we're talking about decarbonisation. Much as we might want to be world leading and encourage others to follow us, it's the other 99+% of the planet that needs to engage as well, and we need to understand and work with. And there you start to realise in places like Nigeria and India that the informal economy looms large. We're in cities which nevertheless are designed for cars, where the majority of people have little choice but to rely upon the public transport system, a meagre offering often, and poor infrastructure for walking and cycling. It comes to issues of dignity, frankly, in relation also to inequality. And they sit alongside a balance of power which is oriented to what was referred to as preference for classes rather than the masses. So we're dealing with wicked problems. How do we store greater equality, greater dignity, greater opportunity to thrive in a healthy, sustainable way? And the feeling is, well, that can only come from fundamental socio-political change, which led us to the notion of revolution, where when enough people have had enough of a failing system, revolution may be coming. And I understand all but one person this morning suggested that we might need revolution. So last slide, Keith, some reflections from me. I've written a paper to accompany this presentation, so there's more detail in that. And at the end of these slides, links to all of the recordings of the fireside chats and the write-ups. But first of all, united. Certainly for me, it's felt that I've had the privilege of going on a remarkable journey of learning, coming together and discovery in this time of shared experience within the crisis that we're still living through. It has been rather overwhelming, I have to say, in terms of appreciating more than I did the enormity of the many wicked problems we're facing in the transport sector. But inspiring as well to be really woken up to the importance of diversity and the strength that we can find there. We've tried across the panels, and I hope some of you will have recognised this, to at the very least address a decent gender balance. We've never had a session with more men than women, and indeed we've worked hard to try and reach further out into racial diversity, ethnic diversity, I should say. And not surprisingly, this has been far from tokenistic. We've reached out to people who are experts in their field and been rewarded by a richness of talent and perspective. It's quite clear that while technology may play a part across all these things, we mustn't be seduced by the promises of technology alone if we're going to shape a better mobility future. And finally, just and green. Through shared learning and being prepared to be upstanders, transport professionals have a chance now to be a force for positive change.